Welcome everyone to the Lawyers Committee and the Truth Action Project program. Today's program is called Recognizing and Pushing Back the Post 9/11 Police State. I'm going to bring on Mick Harrison, our litigation director for the Lawyers Committee. Mick is an excellent attorney. He is totally involved with the Anthrax Committee. He's a key person. And Mick, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. So the Lawyers Committee is involved in a number of legal actions, as Dave mentioned. And one of those is a grand jury petition in New York regarding the demolition evidence for the Trade Center. The next up action of the Lawyers Committee is the petition to Congress that Dave mentioned on the anthrax attacks. And I want to tell you more about that. So the short version is, and the name of my talk is None Dare Call It Treason. And the reason my talk is called that is that the anthrax attacks involved not only, unfortunately, the murder of 5 civilians, but there was an attempt to assassinate 2 United States senators. And because we now know that the source of the anthrax was domestic, it was not foreign, it came from within the United States, we're really talking about an attack initiated in the United States against the United States government. And that's why I call it treason. And that's one of the crimes we'll be addressing in our follow-up act. So the Lawyers Committee is about to file a petition to Congress on the anthrax attacks. As Dave mentioned, we're doing some quality review, expect to file it this week. After that, we're going to file a petition to a grand jury, federal grand jury, on the anthrax attacks. And we hope to get independent counsel appointed because of the FBI's conflict of interest in essentially in having to investigate itself and the DOJ. So I'm going to give you some of the ins and outs of our investigation of the anthrax attacks, and I'll try to make it as brief as I can. The short version is that the FBI became involved in 2000, I guess, September, October 2001, after the attacks through the mail using live anthrax, including the 2 United States senators. The reason my talk is called None Dare Call It Treason is because we now know that those attacks using live anthrax were a domestic source, not foreign, and they attempted to kill 2 United States senators. That meets the definition of treason, which is where the title of my talk comes from. In terms of why the Lawyers Committee got involved in looking at the anthrax attacks in the first place, most of you know by now, these attacks were initiated within a week of 9/11. So they were essentially a second wave, a follow-on set of attacks. And the evidence looks to us like the motive for those anthrax attacks was the same as the motive for the 9/11 attacks. And what we're talking about here is motivating the population to be so afraid that they were willing to support attacks on Iraq, even though they were not involved in the anthrax attacks or the 9/11 attacks, invasion of Afghanistan, and this ongoing war on terror, which we're still involved in. So we decided to look at the anthrax attacks because they were closely related to the 9/11 attacks. Now, what did we find? Well, it's one of those sort of black holes. When you start to look, you know, the more you find. And the first thing we discovered, one of the first things, is that the FBI's own investigation director, Richard Lambert, who eventually left the investigation after 4 years, he was the director of the Anthrax investigation 2002 to 2006. He ended up blowing the whistle on the FBI investigation. And if you read his federal court complaint, you'll see that he lists several disturbing examples of how the FBI essentially obstructed its own investigation. So that caused the Lawyers Committee concern, and it caused me concern as a whistleblower lawyer of many years. So we began to dig deeper, and one of the first bodies of evidence that Dave has already mentioned is that there was a large amount of exculpatory evidence indicating that Bruce Ivins was innocent, the suspect the FBI eventually focused on. And so we started to unpack, where this evidence leads about how the FBI could have gone astray. And the short version of what we found is this. So If you read the FBI documents and the eventual National Research Council report, which came out in 2011 after the FBI closed its investigation, you will learn some pretty simple facts. That is that Dr. Ivins, who worked at the Army facility in Fort Detrick called US AMRID, he did work on anthrax vaccines, highly respected scientist. He had a collection of anthrax that was called RMR 1029. It was basically one or two flasks holding about 1,000 milliliters of anthrax. But what the FBI didn't make clear to the public or the press or to Congress is that Dr. Ivins' anthrax came mostly from Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, the Army's proving ground. 85% of the anthrax in that flask was from Dugway. Ivins added about 15% from his own stock, which we call RMR 1030. He calls it RMR 1030 because, interestingly, he had to reject some of the Dugway anthrax that was shipped to him because it was too contaminated with B. subtilis, a simulant often used by the military and used frequently by Dugway. So 1029, which is what the FBI says was their primary evidence implicating Dr. Ivins, actually was a collection of anthrax, mostly from Dugway. Now, the FBI's main evidence that they say was pointing to Dr. Ivins was state-of-the-art DNA analysis and of the anthrax attack samples and samples collected by the FBI from laboratories around the country. And what the FBI told the public and Congress was that their state-of-the-art DNA analysis created a fingerprint that could associate the attack anthrax with the source of the attack anthrax because of these special mutants, these special DNA variants, which we call morphs, that were found in the attack anthrax. And so the FBI purports to have systematically tested anthrax from all of the labs around the country. And they say that the only supply of anthrax they found containing the fingerprint morphs was Dr. Ivins' flask 1029. Now that turns out to be a completely unsupported conclusion, and I'm going to explain to you why. So what I just told you was Dr. Ivins' 1029 anthrax came from two sources, Ivins' 1030 supply and Dugway. Now, what the FBI didn't make a point of explaining to everyone was that RMR 1030, Dr. Ivins' private stock of anthrax, if you will, was tested. It did not have the fingerprint morphs that the FBI relied on to point to the source of the attack anthrax. Now, what does that mean? If the 1029 flask of Dr. Ivins had only two ingredients, one of which was Dr. Ivins' 1030, and it didn't have the fingerprint morphs, then the fingerprint morphs in 1029, which the FBI confirmed, had to come from Dugway. So the morphs came from Dugway. They didn't come from Dr. Ivins' production of anthrax. But the FBI ruled out Dugway, and they ruled out another military contractor, Laude in Ohio, even though both had the same anthrax, and they actually had it from flask 1029 in addition to their own. So how did the FBI get to the point of ruling out Dugway and Battelle as suspects and pointing to Dr. Ivins when it was clear that their fingerprint didn't come from Dr. Ivins but came from Dugway? And the short answer was they did it disingenuously. Now, if you look through the FBI's documents, you will see something interesting in their report. It's document 40 of the Amerithrax documents posted by the FBI on its lab. And this document is a search by the FBI of Dugway. And it shows that they obtained samples of the production runs by Dugway of the anthrax. And this is the anthrax that went into Ivins' flask 1029. The interesting thing about this document is it says that the samples given to the FBI by Dugway were all dead. None of them were viable samples of anthrax. They'd been apparently irradiated. Now, should that matter? And I'm about to give you my own conclusions here. This is part of what my colleagues at the Lawyers Committee are now doing the quality review on, which we expect to finish so we can file next week. So what I'm about to tell you is opinions of attorney Mick Harrison, not yet the opinions of the Lawyers Committee. So what all of this means to me is, because I didn't realize this until I read the NRC report carefully, and you have to read it carefully. They explain that the FBI adopted a protocol for their fingerprint morphs DNA testing, which requires, in order to even get tested, that a sample of spores first be recultured at the lab before they submit it to the FBI, which means it has to be alive and be able to grow, even to get submitted to the FBI. And then when it gets to the FBI, they have to culture it again, so it has to be able to be alive and grow again. Well, the FBI's collected samples from Dugway wouldn't satisfy that protocol, which means to me the Dugway samples never got tested, very conveniently. Now, they could have been tested because dead biological material still contains DNA. So this was a very convenient way for the FBI to point the finger at Ivins and avoid pointing the finger to military sources like Dugway or Battelle, and it had no basis in science. The NRC criticized the FBI for adopting this protocol and basically said, you know, they could have and should have tested the samples that were not viable. They shouldn't have eliminated those samples simply because they were not viable, because they can be tested by the DNA methodology. So where does that leave us? It means there was no fingerprint pointing to Ivins. The list of suspects should have been broadened, not narrowed. It should have included 100 or more people at Dugway, a large number of people at Battelle. And there also, by the way, were probably at least 100 people at US Ambrid, the Fort Detrick facility where Ivins worked, who had access to Ivins' flask in addition to Ivins. The FBI wants you to believe that Dr. Ivins controlled that flask and no one could access it without his okay. That's false. Colonel Arthur Anderson told the Lawyers Committee that the flask of Dr. Ivins is often stored not in Dr. Ivins' lab where it would be secured, but in another building, 1412, in room, I think it was 115, which did not even have a lock on the door. So the idea that Dr. Ivins controlled this anthrax and that the fingerprint points to his anthrax and not anyone else is simply false. Now, once you realize that, then the question becomes, how do you proceed to narrow the field of suspects? And the short answer is what David started with, and that is there's a silicon coating for the second wave of the anthrax attacks inside the spores, which is a high-tech technology called microencapsulation.
Friendly reminder, 2 minutes, Mick.
Yep, I'm on it. And the microencapsulation is a technology that the evidence indicates that Battelle and maybe Dugway could do. Also, the anthrax was not only dry, but it was highly concentrated, 1 trillion spores per gram. Very few people could do that, but Dugway and Battelle could do that. In addition, you've got this problem of the Bacillus subtilis contamination. Dugway is notorious for having that contamination in their fermenter. They had to discard some of their production runs for Dr. Ivins' anthrax because it had too much of that contamination in it. So this investigation needs to be redone. It needs to be redone with integrity. And that's why we're asking Congress to take a look at this evidence and to have also an independent commission, and why we're going to be asking a grand jury to do it with an independent special counsel. Now, one other thing you should know, and I'll stop, and that is Colonel Anderson informed us that his colleagues, high-level scientists at the Army facility in Maryland, attempted to explain to the commander and get it relayed to the FBI and the Secretary of the Army a lot of these facts I'm telling you, because they knew most of this stuff. And the problem is, when Colonel Anderson attempted to do that, he was informed that there was a high-level visit from the Secretary of the Army, and there was a gag order imposed from either the Secretary or the Chief of Staff of the Army that in effect said, squelch any internal investigations at US Ambrid on the anthrax attacks and squelch any criticism of the FBI's investigation. So, to make a long story short, we're asking for your support in our petition to Congress, in our eventual petition to the grand jury. You should note that even though FBI Director Mueller asked for the NRC to review the FBI science, he closed his investigation before the NRC finished its review. And when its review came out, it basically said the FBI science doesn't work as a real fingerprint. And the last thing I will tell you is that when the Congress asked Director Mueller in a hearing, how did you eliminate Battelle and Dugway from your investigation? He said, I'll have to get back to you on that because you didn't know. And 7 months later, in a written response, he gave a totally illogical explanation. He said, even though these two labs received the 1029 anthrax from Ivins, which is true, that they couldn't have done the attacks and were eliminated from suspicion because even though they had the ability to produce dry anthrax, if they hadn't received the 1029 anthrax, they couldn't have made the attack anthrax. So he was basically saying they received it, but they couldn't have done it because they didn't receive it. And you'll have to, think about that for a while. So I'll leave you at that, David. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mick.